Okay, good evening, everybody. I'd like to introduce to you Peter Thomas, who is going to talk to us on the topic of what have trees ever done for us. Peter Thomas is an emeritus professor at Keele University, an associate of Harvard Forest at Harvard University in the USA. He's the curator of the National Collection of Ornamental Cherries at Keele. His research and teaching are centered around anything to do with trees, and this has taken him to all continents where trees grow. And he's covered numerous topics, from where in the ground water absorbed by roots to seed production and understanding of tree longevity. He's also the author of many scientific papers, monographs, and books on trees, woodland ecology, and forest fires. The books he's written include Trees: A Natural History, published in 2014, The Ecology of Woodlands and the Forests in 2007, Fire in the Forest in 2010, Applied Tree Biology in 2018, and the most recent, Trees, in the new Naturalist series. His CV has an impressive list of publications and awards, which will take most of the coming hour to read, so I won't go through it, but it's very impressive. Thank you, Peter. I think if you can now share your screen with us, then we can start your talk. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And I must say, it's lovely to be able to talk to so many people who are interested in plants. So let's see what we can do. You're probably wondering what I'm going to talk about with a title like this, what have trees ever done for us? We being botanists, when we look at a picture like this, we can appreciate the trees themselves, and we can identify them. We can go into the woodland, look at the bryophytes and the flowering plants, etc. We really quite appreciate them. But most people, most of the general public, I think to them, trees tend to be so much wallpaper behind them. It's things they like to look at, but they don't know much about them. And yet trees impinge on us an awful lot. And that's really what I want to talk about this evening. When you look at around the world, there are, as you might imagine, lots and lots of trees. In fact, now they've been counted. So it's been calculated that there are 3.04 trillion trees on the earth. Now, a trillion that's one with 12 noughts, so that's 3 million trees. That's probably an underestimate as well. There's probably going to be at least another trillion on top of that if you take into account trees that grow outside of woodlands and forests. Now, in that, there are supposed to be around about 60,000 species in the world. It's a bit of an uncertain figure. Some people reckon it might be down to 40,000, other people up to 100,000. It can be quite difficult. I mean, even in this country, it's very difficult to say how many native species of tree we have. I mean, it's anywhere between 32 and 35 if we just include trees that grow over 6 meters tall. If we include shrubs in that, then we're up to around about 200 species. But then do you include hybrids in that? And if you're looking at elm trees, how many elm species do you include? That's anywhere between 2 and 59, depending on which flora you look at. And then what about microspecies of things like sorbus? Do we include those as well? If we include all of these things, we go up to just north of 300 woody species in Britain. But even that doesn't really show us how important trees are. I think what's much more important is how much the trees on the earth actually weigh. It's been calculated that on the earth, all the living things together make up 1,100 gigatons of biomass. And a gigaton is one with 9 noughts after it, so that's really billions. So we're looking at 1,100 billion tons of living stuff on the surface of the earth. Now, of that great amount, plants make up about 82% of it. Now, if you think about this, how much do you reckon animals make up? Well, it's obviously got to be less than 18%, isn't it? Because you can't go above 100%. In actual fact, plants make up 0.4% of the biomass of the earth. And think about how many programs you've watched that Attenborough's presented and how many of them actually to do with animals. And yet plants, in terms of biomass, are infinitely more important. And for me as a tree biologist, If you look at what proportion of the plants are made up of trees, then it's about 60% of the world's biomass is made up of trees. So it shows that trees are really hugely important for the future of the world, because if we're looking at climate change, they play a very big part. If we're looking at habitats for other wildlife, they're also really very important indeed. Now in this country, we have lots of really interesting trees. Here's one I saw 2 days ago in Welwyn Garden City. It's probably the biggest and therefore probably the oldest wild service tree that I've ever seen in Britain. And it's within 2 minutes walk of John Lewis in the middle of Welwyn Garden City. I mean, how many people walk past this and they don't actually really see it at all? It's just part of the background. I should say, just in passing, as you'll undoubtedly know, Sorbus as a genus is being broken up. So in the future, this is probably not going to be Sorbus torminalis, it'll be Torminalis glaberrima. Names keep on changing, don't they? But let's look around at what most people will see about trees. What I want to do is to look at some of the words associated with trees, have a look at what things we use for food and drink, other compounds we get from trees, then have a look at street trees, and also most importantly, look at tree planting, and especially to look at whether tree planting will actually get us out of problems with climate change. Politicians obviously want that to happen, but is it true? Will it really happen? And then last of all, I'll go on to look at well-being and the role of trees in our well-being. But let's start first of all with words that we have in the English language. We have a huge number that are to do with trees. I could probably spend the next hour at least listing all the words that are associated with trees. But let me just give you one example. This, as you can see on the screen, is the bay laurel, Laurus nobilis. So it's the noble laurel. And this is the one we use in cooking. It's the bay leaf of cooking. When you look at the bay leaf, the bay laurel, you'll know that Roman athletes were given laurel wreaths to put around their heads. And in the Middle Ages, this was extended to poets and scholars, so we get poet laureate. So that's one word we get from the bay laurel. Now, if you look at the berries of the bay, the official term for those in Latin is baccalaureus. So bacca, berry, laurus, the laurel. And you can see from that we get things like baccalaureate and bachelor's degrees. And because Roman students were forbidden to marry, we also get unmarried bachelors from that as well. So all these words from one tree, I say the list could go on. But let's move on. Think about food, things like fruit and nuts that we get from trees. I mean, how many fruits do we not get from trees? Well, if we list the ones we do, it's all the citrus fruits that we have. It's things like grapes, so berries. In fact, really, citrus fruit and grapes are both berries, just the citrus fruit is a slightly more specialized form. Then think about all the things like apples and pears, all the poms that we get from trees. Incidentally, when you look at the apple, the actual fruit is the part in the middle, it's the core. So when you eat into the apple, once you reach those sort of toenail-y bits, that's when you actually start getting to the true fruit. But what's happened is that the base of the fruit, the receptacle, has actually grown around the outside. It's grown up from the top of the stalk around the outside and meets right down at the very bottom, here where you see the remains of the flower. And when you eat the apple, what you're really eating is a fleshy receptacle of the flower. And then we throw the actual fruit away with the core. Now, as well as these, we also have things like the stone fruit. So if you think of the fruits that we eat that don't come from trees, it's really restricted to things like pineapples and strawberries. And so think how impoverished our diet would be if we didn't have trees around. And think about all the nuts that we eat. All of these come from trees. You know, whether you're looking at walnuts, almonds, etc., they're all growing on trees. The only nut that we eat commonly that doesn't come from a tree is the peanut, which, as you know, grows on a sort of a herbaceous vine. Now, while we're talking about nuts, I wonder if you recognise the nut that comes from this plant. If I chop one of these open, that's what it looks like. You can probably guess what this is. I'm sure you're right. It's the cashew, Anacardium occidentale. When you look at the seed, it's the part we eat as the cashew nut. It grows in that little comma-shaped fruit below the sort of apple part of the plant. What we've got here is that the little comma-shaped part at the bottom, the red part, is the fruit, but the stalk of the flower has enlarged to make this cashew apple. And you can eat the cashew apple if you like. It's a bit like eating an apple full of turpentine. It's not particularly pleasant. But if you think about it, you can see why this has grown the way it has. Because if a monkey, for example, or another animal wants to come along and eat this, it's not going to eat the bit at the bottom. It's going to want something juicy to eat. So the stalk of the flower has become, in effect, the fruit, and that's what the big animals will take away and eat. The very bottom part that contains the seed is actually really quite toxic, and that's dropped by the animals onto the ground. And that means that the seed inside the fruit can then escape, germinate, and you have the next tree. In fact, the fruit, the red fruit at the bottom, is so toxic that I had a colleague that when we first saw these trees growing in Honduras, he took one of them and cracked it open with his teeth. And within less than a minute, all his lips were blistered, as was his tongue. So the fruit itself contains really quite nasty chemicals. You can see why they do, because the animal, the monkey or whatever that eats the apple part will drop the fruit with the seed in it and won't eat it because it's too toxic. But fortunately, the one seed you get in the cashew fruit is not toxic, and we can eat that with impunity. But you can see along the way why cashew nuts are so expensive, because you get one seed, one nut from each fruit. While we're talking about fruits, I can't pass by without talking about durian fruits. If any of you have been to Southeast Asia, you'll have experienced these, I'm sure. Most hotels, certainly all airlines, taxis, buses, forbid you to bring these things in on the premises because they smell. They really do smell very pungent. It's a bit like, or to me, it's a bit like rotting sewage. It's a very pungent scent indeed. If you cut open these fruits, what you're left with on the inside is a bunch of seeds that are coated in this sort of like congealed custard. And it's the congealed custard part you actually eat. And it has a particularly interesting flavour. Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a contemporary of Darwin and travelled a lot in Southeast Asia, he wrote, "A rich butter-like custard, highly flavoured with almonds, but intermingled with it comes wafts of cream cheese, onion sauce, brown sherry, and other incongruities." Now, I think he was being quite polite, really. If you ask me what durian tastes like, it tastes a bit like rotting garlic mixed with chili squeezed through a very old sock. It's a very distinctive, peculiar flavour. Most Westerners don't like it at all, for obvious reasons. But if you think about it, the reason why the durian smells so much, and which gives it the flavour as well, is because of these animals, the orangutans. The durian tree grows quite singly in amongst the forest, and when the fruits ripen, it has to advertise the fact to the orangutans, which are the main distributors of the seed. So it has this very peculiar pungent smell that drifts through the forest, and the orangutans will travel long distances to actually get to the fruits to eat them. They eat the custard on the inside, eat the seeds, and either spit the seeds out or they go straight through and come out the other end. Either way, by the time the animals moved away and got rid of the seeds, it's distributed the seeds for the plant. So a very effective mechanism of shedding seeds. When it comes to other chemicals that we find quite useful in trees, I think probably the most obvious place to start is with aspirin, which is found in willow trees. I mean, inside the bark of the tree especially, you can find a primitive form of aspirin, which is salicylic acid. And if in Middle Ages you had a headache, you would go and find a willow tree, take a piece of the bark off, chew it, and you would get hopefully enough salicylic acid to actually cure your headache. It's interesting when you look at the trees, the salicylic acid is actually a defense hormone. So if you look at this willow tree, say insects started to chew on one side of it, that chewing would release salicylic acid from the cells, which will partly move systemically through the tree, but will also blow in the wind from the damaged leaves. And that blowing in the wind is the quickest way of getting the salicylic acid to the rest of the tree. And then the rest of the tree knows that part of it's being attacked by insects, and it will start growing extra defense chemicals even before those leaves are damaged. So a really very useful compound in the tree. I should say that most trees produce salicylic acid. So you can find that a willow tree will let the oak tree next to it know that it's being attacked, and the oak tree will respond in the same way. Now, some people have said that this is the trees communicating or talking to each other and actually helping each other. I think actually it's really more of a case of the next tree down the road that's getting the wind blown from the willow tree is overhearing what's going on in the willow tree. And the willow tree is not trying to help the oak tree is just responding to what it can perceive in the wind. Other very useful compounds that we use are things like quinine from cinchona species in South America, sometimes known as the quinine tree, or otherwise known as Jesuit's bark, because it's the bark of the tree that contains most of the quinine. And that quinine is there to stop insects from chewing their way through the bark and into the tree. From our point of view, we find it really quite useful because quinine is a preventative and a curative of malaria. And so when we were out in India and places like that, you had to take quinine as a medicine every day. What better way than to take it in gin and tonic? Very polite way, nice way of drinking your very bitter medicine. Other compounds that we use are perhaps not quite so nice to us, but still we find quite useful. I mean, my grandmother in the, must have been in the 60s, used to have a jar of strychnine down in the cellar, which she used to kill rats with. Now that's no longer allowed. But the strychnine you get from the Strychnos nuts vomica tree is really a very potent poison. Now the leaves you see here, which are quite distinctive, being shiny green and having those three veins running down the middle, they contain a certain amount of strychnine, but it's really the seeds that contain most of them. And you can see how big the seeds are from my fingers there. I reckon there's probably enough poison in those two seeds to do away with most of Keele University, where I still live and work. So it's really quite a potent poison. And you can see that because it's got most in the seeds, that's where you get the species name from, Nux vomica, the nut that induces vomiting. The local people where these photographs were taken in Cambodia actually use these nuts as a mild pick-me-up. You know, in the late afternoon when they're feeling a bit tired, they'll take one of these nuts and just give them a little nibble. So they're actually taking in a fair bit of strychnine. You have to be quite careful with strychnine. It is a really quite nasty poison. Now, I apologise for the next picture. This is a painting that was made by Sir Charles Bell in 1809. Quite why he wanted to paint somebody who was dying of strychnine poison, I don't know, but it does show quite nicely what actually happens when you ingest strychnine. It's a muscle contractant, so all the big muscles in the body go into spasm, including the big muscles down beside the spine. So somebody that's been poisoned with strychnine, you'll often find that the back of their head, maybe the shoulders and their feet are on the floor, but the rest is arching upwards. In fact, it can be so great that you can find someone who's died of strychnine poisoning with the back of the head touching their buttocks, because the contractions in the big muscles have been so much, it's actually snapped the spine in half. So really quite a potent poison. So why would the plant ever evolve a poison like that? Well, you find it mostly in the seeds, and it's there to stop the seeds being eaten before they can germinate. There are other compounds we find slightly more palatable. The picture at the top with the red berries, you might recognise that. That's a coffee bush, a coffea species. And each of those red berries contains 2 of the coffee beans. And that's why coffee beans are the shape they are, because you have to fit 2 together into each berry. The picture at the bottom, you might recognise as Camellia sinensis, otherwise known as tea. And of course, what these 2 share most is a caffeine. And we quite like caffeine. A little bit of caffeine does us good, doesn't it? But if you drink too much caffeine, what happens? Well, you start getting heart palpitations. And if you drink really too much of it, it can actually kill you. And this is exactly what it does in the plants when insects come and attack the plants. The insects get too much caffeine and they get the jitters. They either fall off, they go somewhere else, or they certainly stop feeding. Another plant that contains chemicals that really quite like are cloves. When my same grandmother had the strychnine, if I was young and I had a toothache, she'd give me a clove to chew on because it contains a mild anaesthetic. Now, if you look at the cloves, you can perhaps see what part of the plant they actually are. They're actually the flower buds of the clove tree. So you can see the sepals, big woody sepals sticking out. Well, actually, they're bracts. Then the sepals are covering the flower bud and the petals are on the inside. And the reason why these contain this mild anaesthetic is to stop insects from eating the flower buds before they can open. So the anaesthetic does the same to me as it does to the insects. It makes them drowsy, stops them wanting to feed, and the buds are unmolested. Perhaps my favourite set of chemicals of all come from the nutmeg. When you look at the picture at the bottom, you can see that the nutmeg actually grows inside an apple-like fruit. And then in the middle, you've got the black seed. Well, the blackness comes from the seed coat. Take the seed coat off, you end up with what the bare seeds you can see on the right-hand side. And you'll also see that around the outside of the black seed, there is this red part. Now, this is an aril. It's an outgrowth from the seed. And commercially, it's what you buy as mace, which is the spice that has a sort of very mild nutmeg flavour. What happens with the nutmeg is that larger animals will come and eat the apple, and they will drop the seed with its aril on the ground. These are then collected by ants because the ants like to eat the aril. So they take this into the nest, they eat the aril, but they don't eat the seed because the seed is too toxic. And then, of course, the seed is buried underground in a perfect place to germinate. So this two-stage dispersal is actually a really good way of getting the next generation of nutmegs to grow. If you look at nutmeg, it has the scientific name of Myristica fragrans, and it gets that name because it contains a compound called myristicine, which is actually psychoactive. So you can get a high from nutmeg. So if you take 1 teaspoon, 1 level teaspoon of freshly ground nutmeg, which is about half a nutmeg, it will give you hallucinations. Unfortunately, it will also probably give you nausea, vomiting, and perhaps circulatory collapse. But certainly if you take 5 level teaspoons of nutmeg, I guarantee it'll be lethal to anybody. Myristicine really is quite an unpleasant poison. In fact, it's so unpleasant that really, if nutmeg was about to come on the market now, I'm sure it would never be allowed. It would never get through health and safety regulations. It really is too toxic. So if your spouse or partner starts giving you more rice puddings with nutmeg on a Sunday, you might want to quite ask, why am I getting so many doses of nutmeg? And I should also point out that it's been shown in mice at least that nutmeg is actually a very potent aphrodisiac. So if you are getting more rice puddings on a Sunday, you really want to know why you're being given the rice puddings. It could make Sunday afternoons quite interesting in all sorts of different ways. I should point out the amount of nutmeg you actually eat on an ordinary rice pudding is very, very unlikely to do any harm whatsoever. So keep enjoying nutmeg. And while we're looking at compounds, there's one set of compounds that illustrates really just how poisonous some of these things are. And that's when you look at eucalyptus oil. I mean, what's the one animal that tends to eat eucalyptus and nothing else? Well, of course, you know, it's the koala. This particular koala has been involved in a forest fire. That's why it's got those red bandages on its paws and a little red burnt nose, poor little thing. The reason why it was hurt in a forest fire is that koalas are really very unintelligent animals. And they're unintelligent because of the food they eat. When they eat eucalyptus leaves, they have to spend so much energy detoxifying the eucalyptus oil that there's very little energy left over for running the koala. And the brain is a very expensive organ in terms of energy. So over evolutionary time, the brain of the koala has become smaller and smaller and is now just able to keep the koala functioning. So they are really, well, they're certifiably thick, the poor little things, but it's not their fault. It's because of the toxicity of the food they're actually eating. Now, moving away from food, let's have a think about street trees and the value of street trees. If you look at the effect of these trees on pollution, as it says here, that trees can remove up to 70% of gaseous pollutants like ozone, sulfur dioxide and nitrous dioxide. It can filter them out. So if you're living in houses beside a busy road and you have trees in between you and them, especially if they come down to ground level, then you actually may be spared a fair bit of the gaseous pollutants. It's also been shown that 1 hectare of woodland removes about 15 tonnes of particulate matter from the air each year. Now, London's got something like 8.4 million trees. So that's an awful lot of trees removing an awful lot of particulate matter. The particulate matter tends to stick to the leaves, especially if they've got lots of hairs on them. And then when it rains, they get washed out down to the ground, which means you're not breathing them into your lungs. Now, most of this 15 tonnes is PM 2.5, particulate matter smaller than 2.5 micrometers in diameter. And that's the stuff that goes right down to the bottom of your lungs and is particularly damaging to your health. So we have a lot to be thankful for trees in cities. Street trees also make it a lot cooler, feel a lot cooler underneath because you're not getting the direct insulation from the sun hitting you. So it just feels cooler. And that's also beneficial to buildings as well, because it means that the buildings in the summer stay a bit cooler, so you don't have to use as much energy cooling them down. And in the winter, it tends to keep them a bit warmer, so you don't have to spend as much energy heating them up. And it's been shown in London, the energy savings attributed to trees in relation to buildings is in the order of £260,000 a year. And this data comes from iTree, and I'll talk a bit more about iTree in a minute. I mean, £260,000 doesn't sound a lot, but think how much carbon that's going to save in terms of heating and cooling costs. And it's done free of charge by the trees. These same street trees, and especially if they're associated with lawns and other green spaces, it's been shown they increase tendency to walk for recreation and to walk to work. So there's another saving in carbon because people are not driving as much to go to work. But also it tends to weld together communities because people are outside, they're walking, they talk to their neighbours. They get to know that Mrs. Smith hasn't been seen for several days and we better go and try and find out why. So it's really good for social cohesion. And it's been shown quite conclusively that lower income groups benefit the most from green space near their home. Now, it's a bit paradoxical, really, isn't it? Because you look around most suburbs of London and other cities, it's the more expensive houses that tend to have more trees around them. Where in actual fact, those trees would be more beneficial around lower income housing. It's been shown that people that have more trees around them, they have less dependence on antidepressants, they have less emergencies that take them to hospital, and they have better health all around. They also get more exercise, less obesity, with obviously benefits. So street trees really are quite important to us. But they're also important in other ways as well. Ever thought about the effect of trees on bomb blast protection? Well, there's a group in Germany that have spent a fair bit of time blowing up trees. I mean, it sounds like a dream job to me. And in one particular experiment, they took thuya trees, evergreen thuya. It doesn't say which thuya, but it's probably Thuya plicata, the western red cedar. And they had evergreen trees with broad leaves like cherry laurel, Prunus ceracifera. And in front of these hedges, which are about 2 meters long, they let off the equivalent of 5 kilograms of TNT just to see what would happen. Well, here's the result. Here's what actually it looks like. And you'll see the thuyas on the left, they don't even show they've actually been through an explosion at all. Where the poor old cherry laurel on the right looks a bit tattered, poor thing. But with the thuya, when they measured the explosion pressure behind, they found there was a 62% reduction half a metre behind the hedge. And that's a significant reduction in pressure wave from the blast. So maybe in cities more and more we're going to see hedges of plants appearing. They need to be just above ordinary head height, and they may give a lot of protection from bomb blast to people. The people doing these experiments, they actually look to see whether they could find anything better than hedges of evergreen shrubs to stop bomb blast. The only thing they found that was better was a hanging chain link fence with water running down it the whole time. That was actually up to about 70% reduction of bomb blast. So really, in terms of infrastructure and ease of and cheapness of growing, we might well be seeing more hedges in our cities. What I want to turn to now is to look at tree planting. There's an awful lot said about tree planting. Certainly people like Oliver Rackham, lots of other people like that have been quite critical of tree planting, often because we tend to plant trees where trees are growing perfectly well already. I mean, certainly at Keele University, we've had students planting birch trees in the woodlands, and they've been planting the birch trees in amongst existing birch seedlings, which is in some ways it can be seen as a waste of the time. In actual fact, it was very good for the students to actually get experience and interested in planting trees. So there are some reasons why we shouldn't be planting trees, but when you look at this picture here, this is a picture of Prunus sargentii, Sargent's cherry, growing in northern Japan. They've obviously been planted beside the roads. Isn't that just a wonderful sight to feast your eyes on? And we are going into a more and more tree planting these days, but not necessarily in the way we used to. We're seeing more and more micro forests or tiny forests. I'm not sure how many of these you have in London, but they're ideally suited for urban areas. This particular one is in Witney near Oxfordshire, and it was planted a couple of years ago. And it was planted using the Miyawaki method. And that's named after Akira Miyawaki, who was a Japanese, or is a Japanese botanist, and he perfected this technique. Often the plots are very small. They can be as little as 3 by 4 meters. The one in Witney here is slightly larger, obviously. You start off the process by improving the soil by covering it with organic matter. In this case, in Witney, it was straw. In other cases, people have used everything. Coffee grounds, old cotton t-shirts, you name it, people have used to put on the ground. And then what you do is you plant trees and shrubs, and you plant them very densely, often between 2 to 7 trees per square metre. Now, this might be perceived as a bit of a waste because some of these are going to die, but the competition between them ensures that the strongest trees survive and they grow tall very quickly. This can also be quite useful in tree planting schemes because if some of the trees are not planted as well as others, well, they're probably going to die anyway. So you're not left with holes in the plantation. The whole point of doing this is that within 1 or 2 decades, you end up with a dense woodland with a surprisingly higher biodiversity. Now, most experiments using this have been done in the tropics, but it's now being done more and more in temperate areas as well, with surprisingly good results. It means you can get quite a dense forest with a high biodiversity in a very small area, and it can be right amongst buildings, etc. So really quite a useful technique. Now, this particular one at Witney in the top right was planted in 2020. Here's the same thing a year later. It has a fence around it, more just to delimitate the area rather than because it needs any sort of protection. And through the gate, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a series of these benches. And what you can't see is on the right-hand side off the picture, there is a housing estate. And if you go there, you'll see that about 10 o'clock, people start coming out their houses with a cup of coffee and they go and sit together on these little benches and they talk to each other. So it's again it's a way of encouraging ownership of the little bit of woodland and in getting people to talk to each other, more social cohesion. Now that was in 2021. Here it is 2 years later. The benches are still there. People still come out and drink their coffee. But if you walk through this little woodland, about half the initial trees are dead. But the ones that have survived, the fittest ones, are much taller than they would have been if they'd been planted on a normal planting scheme. So I think there's room for lots of tree planting in urban areas, and I think it's very good for communities to plant trees, and it has all sorts of wildlife benefits. But what about planting trees to save us from climate change? Can we plant enough trees to remove carbon from the atmosphere to actually save us from climate change problems? I mean, lots of people would like us to do this. I mean, here, as a picture I've stolen off the web, this is in Yorkshire, and you'll see this entire farm has been planted by trees as a carbon sink. And when you look at tree planting objectives, I mean, certainly in the last general election, there were all sorts of claims about how many trees we needed and how many trees we could plant. So the Conservatives reckon they wanted to plant 30 million trees. The Lib Dems and Scots and Nats, they went up to 60 million trees. The Green parties reckon they're going to plant 700 million trees. And of course, the dear old Labour Party, they decided they want to plant 2 billion by the year 2040, which actually meant planting 250,000 trees per day. Probably a little optimistic. But certainly in Canada, it's been suggested by the government, it's been planned by the government, that they're going to plant 2 billion trees by the year 2030. And that's because primarily in Canada, such a huge country with so many forests, forestry there is still largely a matter of mining trees. You go in, you cut the area and you walk away. It's almost treated like a non-renewable resource. But now they're trying to go in behind the forestry and actually replant some of these areas to ensure that they have tree stocks in the future. And just south of the border in America, Trump decided when he was on the throne that he would actually plant 2 trillion trees, a very impressive target. Perhaps a little more rationally, the National Trust have decided they wanted to plant 20 million trees by the year 2030 to become carbon neutral. So all the carbon they use in terms of running their business, running the houses, running the landscape, people driving to work and home again, they wanted to plant enough trees that would soak up the equivalent amount of carbon that they actually release. And so they worked out they need to plant 20 million trees by the year 2030. Does it work? Well, one thing we need to look at is where in a forest carbon is actually stored. Where is the carbon sequestered? Now, here's research figures from Forest Research, what used to be part of the Forestry Commission, and these came out in 2021. The numbers themselves don't really matter very much. It's in millions of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. What is important is where the carbon is stored. And you'll see it in the first line, we've got carbon in above ground biomass. And if you look at the amount, it's actually 17% of the total, which is not very much, is it? Now, if you look at the bottom line, the soil carbon, there you're looking at a figure of 69%. And if you include in the lines above it, the carbon that's stored in the litter, the dead wood, and in the living roots below ground, then below ground, you've got 83% of the carbon that's been stored in that woodland. So, 4/5 of the carbon in the forest is below ground. Now, admittedly, most of this is conifer plantation, which will have more in the ground than above. But even if you look at something like a beech woodland, you're still looking at about 60% of the carbon being below ground, and at most 40% being in the above ground biomass. So what happens below ground, whatever the forest you're looking at, it's really quite important to carbon sequestration. There is a problem though, and the problem is that if you look at where we're going to plant most trees at any great scale, it's going to tend to be on wet grassland and moorland. Now the problem is if you plant trees on these soils, there is a carbon loss on planting. Now this is partly because of the disturbance of the soil. You've got all that carbon stored in the soil. When you dig holes to put the trees in, you let in oxygen in. And when you let oxygen in, the microbes, the bacteria and the fungi will start decomposing the organic matter more quickly, which releases carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And in wet grassland and moorland, this could go on for 40 years after planting. And only after 40 years are you getting to the point where you're back to where you started before you planted the trees. Now, the trouble is that, and the fact that trees take time to grow is a big problem. If we've got 15 years, 20 years at most to solve climate change, planting trees on these soils is not going to be the solution. Because by the time we should have solved climate change, these soils are still producing more carbon into the atmosphere than they're taking up. Now, if you're going to plant on agricultural soils, that is quicker. And that loss of carbon after planting may go on just for maybe a few years, maybe up to 5 years at most. And the other problem is that because the trees do take time to grow, don't they? They will eventually soak up lots of carbon. But how much carbon will these trees soak up in a short time? Probably nowhere near enough to actually solve our problem. I should point out that you could look at these soils and say, okay, we won't plant seedlings. What about if we drop seeds on the surface of the soil? Will that solve the problem? Well, actually it doesn't, because when the seeds start growing, you know that most living things will have mycorrhizae on the roots. So fungi, beneficial fungi on the roots. Well, it so happens that the mycorrhizae that most trees have is different from the mycorrhizae on the grasses. And the tree's mycorrhizae actually help the microbes to decompose the organic matter, releasing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So even sowing seeds on these ground is going to cause a carbon loss to the soils for a few years. So if we put all this together and we look at the figures produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, sort of an international panel of hundreds of scientists, they produced their latest report just last year, and it was over 6,000 pages long, so very detailed indeed. They've looked at what happens if we do everything we can by the year 2050, so 20 odd years time, in terms of protecting forests and planting more trees where it's politically possible and physically feasible. Then those trees and forests will soak up about 12 to 15% of our carbon emissions. So planting trees is not going to solve our problem. I mean, tree planting is not the magic carbon dioxide sponge. If we've got to solve climate change in 15 to 20 years, then trees just won't be able to do it. They're not unimportant. If they soak up 12 to 15% of our carbon emissions, that's a really useful 12 to 15%. So I'm not saying we shouldn't plant trees at all. Carry on planting the trees, but they're not going to solve our problem. They're not going to soak up all the carbon dioxide that we produce in our daily lives. But that's not to say that woodlands and forests are unimportant in climate change. They are. And they're important because of the amount of carbon dioxide they've been soaking up over thousands, and in some cases, millions of years. And it's not just old woodlands like this one. This is the Major Oak and Sherwood Forest. It's not just them that are important. Street trees are also very important as well. This is where I come to iTree. I'm sure you've all heard of iTree. It's an American invention. And the idea is you go to an urban area like a city. This happens to be Edinburgh. You work out where you're going to sample in a very characteristic way. And you go to each of those black dots on the map and you look at things like, well, on the left, you look at land use, percent tree cover, etc., etc. And where you find trees, you look at the species, how big they are, and how healthy they are. You plug all of these figures into a very large computer program, and it comes up with values you can put on trees. So here's some I've chosen pretty much at random. Torbay was one of the first ones that was done in Britain. I've got London in there, obviously, and for a comparison, Oldham and Edinburgh. Now, if you look at the figures for London, the survey was done in 2015, and it concluded that in London, there's 8.4 million trees. That's almost as many as there are people in Greater London. Is that 9.6 million at the moment, I think it is? So an incredible number of trees. And if you look at canopy cover, the canopy cover in London is higher than any other city I've listed here, 21%. So if you're flying over in an aeroplane or a helicopter and look down, 21% of the ground will be covered by the canopy of trees. Now, if you consider that in Great Britain, the cover of trees is about 13%, London really is a very treed environment. Now, I've given some figures here for how much the trees are worth in terms of pollution removal. So 126.1 million. I could have included lots of other figures for things like stormwater removal, etc., etc. But I've also given you carbon storage. And in London, the trees are worth £146.9 million for carbon storage. Now that figure is derived by saying, okay, if you look at how much carbon is stored in the trees and the trees weren't doing it, how much would it cost to do it by other methods? And the answer is £146.9 million. Now, there are some problems with some of these numbers. I won't go into all the ins and outs of how reliable they are, but they are quite useful, because if you've got, say, an area of London where somebody wants to put up a new building and they can say it will generate this much in taxes, this much in extra employment, they can put a pound's value on what their development's going to produce. And it might be removing some trees. You say, well, you can't build the building because these trees are going to go. You say, well, how much are those trees worth? Nothing compared to how much the building's worth. But at least iTree now gives you an approximate value you can actually put onto those trees. So it really is quite useful. Now that value of 146.9 million, that's equivalent to 2.4 million tonnes of carbon stored in London's trees. Now, to put that into perspective, every person in Greater London could fly to New York from London and still not produce 2.4 million tonnes of carbon. So it's a huge amount of carbon that is being stored in London's trees. Now, if you look at what that looks like globally, just for comparison, I've given you there the global carbon emissions that we produce every year into the atmosphere globally. And we're producing 8.3 gigatons or 8.3 billion tonnes of carbon into the atmosphere. Now, at the moment, the carbon stored in the world's forests is around 2,780 gigatons, a huge amount. Now, to put that into perspective, the amount that's already in the atmosphere at the moment is around about 829 gigatons. So what would happen if all the world's forests died? I mean, it's been suggested by some right-wing think tanks in the States that this might well happen. Climate will change too quickly for our forests to survive and they will all die. Probably a bit extreme, but let's take it as a hypothetical question. What would happen if they all did die and all the carbon that was stored above ground and below ground was released into the atmosphere? Well, the answer is that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere would reach 1,700 parts per million. Now you might think, well, that doesn't mean very much to me. Well, let me show you a graph. Sorry about this, old graph here. This shows you the green line is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last 160,000 years. And as you go across the graph, you'll see it has fluctuated up and down a fair bit. But once you come through to now, or the Industrial Revolution, you'll see that green line is just shot up skywards. And you'll see at the moment, halfway down the figure, we've got the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at the moment is currently 421 parts per million. Now, every time I use this graph, I have to move that figure up. Last year, it was 416 parts per million. So it's going up quite a lot. It's been suggested if we get up to the top of this green line and we get up to 650 parts per million, a so-called business as usual scenario, we don't do much to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide we're producing, we are going to be in serious trouble. The global average temperatures will go above 2 degrees centigrade. It will cause all sorts of problems. Now, if we get rid of all of our forests, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere will go up to 1,700 parts per million. And I can't even show you where that is on the graph. It's way, way off the top. If that ever happens, I think we as a human race will be in serious, serious difficulty. So really, when you look at it, when you look at the bottom line, the trees we have already are really very important. So carbon dioxide uptake by planted trees that we can plant now is small in comparison to emissions. Doesn't mean we shouldn't plant trees, but it's not going to solve our problem. But as you said in the middle of the screen, the carbon already stored in trees and forests is hugely important. So we have a choice between planting more trees now and keeping the trees we've got already, then reducing deforestation really is critical to us as a human race. When I mention deforestation, you're probably immediately thinking of things like, I don't know, the Amazon basin, places like that, but it also applies locally as well. If you've got some money and you can either spend it on planting new trees or you can use it on rehabilitating a bit of derelict woodland that maybe has been used for mountain biking or bigger vehicles, so the soil's compacted, so the trees are not growing very well. If you can rehabilitate that woodland to make sure the carbon stored in the soil is kept, that's probably more important to climate change than planting new trees. And yet you look at what goes on around us, we're always wanting to plant new trees to solve climate change. But actually keeping the woodlands we've got already and improving their health is much, much more important. Right, I'll get off that soapbox now. Let me come to the last of the subjects I was going to talk about, and that's our well-being. I'll come back to this one picture because I really quite like this picture. And you look at these cherry trees, and doesn't that just gladden the heart? And it's true, if you look at various scenes around Britain, trees are important to our well-being. I mean, the picture on the left is Lichfield Cathedral. I know it's quite grand architecture, but it's got a lot of trees around it as well. Picture on the right-hand side is a miscellaneous part of Liverpool, and there is a tree, but it's right down the end of the road. Now, both these pictures are taken in winter, but even so, which picture does your eye gravitate to most? And I'm sure it's going to be the one of the cathedral, not just because of the cathedral, but because of the green stuff and the woody stuff that's growing around it. There have been quite a few studies that have shown that trees are actually good for us. In this particular study done in 2014, people were sat down in front of a computer screen and they were shown hundreds of pictures of scenes of Taiwan. That's where the study was done. What the people didn't realise, the subjects didn't realise, is they're actually being shown pairs of pictures out of order. And you'll see if you look at these two pictures, the only difference between these two pictures is that the one on the right has had trees digitally added to it. Otherwise, they're exactly the same. So they could look at the response of people to a picture with and without trees, but they wouldn't have realised they were looking at the same pictures because they were looking at so many. And they found that people, when they looked at the pictures with trees, they had a greater sense of calmness. They had a greater sense that they could get up and do a difficult task with ease. So it was actually improving their mental health psychologically just by looking at pictures of trees. Perhaps the first study that was done that showed that trees were good for our well-being was done by this chap Ulrich, who was is a gallbladder surgeon. And he published his paper in the journal Science called "View Through a Window May Influence Recovery from Surgery." He didn't have that word may in to start with, it was will influence recovery from surgery. But the editors of the journal thought this was a wacky idea that they made him put may in the middle, just to hedge their bets. He was working in a hospital where the wards, these were indicated patients' rooms, these were he put his patients, and they were all patients that had gallbladder operations. And he found that the people that were on the left-hand side of the room, when they looked out the window, they could just see a brick wall. Whereas people on the right-hand side of the ward, when they looked out the window, they could see trees. And that was the only difference between them, what they could see out the window, either a brick wall or trees. And he found that the people that could see trees had a less negative attitude to their recovery, they made a quicker recovery, they needed fewer painkillers, and they had fewer complications. So just by looking at trees out of a window, it actually improved their health, it improved their recovery from surgery. And this is why if you look at hospitals around the country, they're spending more and more time and money planting green areas around hospitals because it's good for the patients. In my local hospital here, there's a great courtyard in the middle, and they're planting trees in those courtyards now, so that as they grow taller, even the people on the top floors will be able to see trees through their windows, because it's good for their health. So trees are good psychologically, whether you can actually see them in real or just see pictures of them, they're good for you. But it's also been shown that trees are good for us physiologically. Now, this poor chap here who looks like he's being tortured, he's not really. You'll see that there's this metal canister beside this victim sitting here, and there's a tube coming out of it, which comes to a funnel just underneath his head. Air is being drawn in from outside the room. It passes through that metal cylinder and then is just breathed past his face. So as he breathes in, he's breathing in air that's been through the cylinder. Now, in some cases, that cylinder contains branches of plum that are in flower. In other cases, there's no woody material in there whatsoever. Now, interestingly, the subjects that are sitting there, they can't tell whether they're actually smelling plum flowers or not. The smell is so subtle that they can't detect it in their noses. But you'll notice that these people have got these hats on. They're not being tortured. These are probes that are actually measuring through the scalp the amount of blood in various parts, the amount of oxygen in the blood in various parts of the brain. In fact, they're looking at the memory and the speech center, which they would chose pretty randomly. And they found that the people who were sitting there who could smell, or rather, they were being exposed to the plum fragrance, had more blood oxygen in those two centers of the brain than those that were not exposed to the plum fragrance. So even though they couldn't smell it themselves, their bodies were perceiving it and their bodies were reacting to it physiologically. Now, just another example here. In the middle, you've got a room. The participants were coming into the room and they were sitting down at a computer, and it was a psychological experiment. They were doing complex math problems as quickly as possible, really quite stressful. But they had two rooms. One of the rooms, the room you see here, was lined with timber. And as you see at the top of the screen, the timber was cut to increase its surface area so that the smell of the timber would permeate the room. And the other room had no timber in it. And they compared how the people did with and without the smell of wood. Well, they found that when they finished, that the participants in the room with the wood did exactly the same amount of problems as the people with no wood. There's no difference whatsoever. They behaved in exactly the same way. However, the people that were in the wooded room, when they measured the blood cortisol level, and cortisol is a stress hormone, the levels were much lower. So just smelling the wood, even though they weren't aware they were smelling the wood, actually helped their stress levels. It reduced their stress. And so that's why we come through to things like Shunrin Yoku. I'm sure you've all seen this many times in the press. The sign on the left-hand side is encouraging you to breathe in the air. And this is translated as either forest air bathing or forest therapy, because it's good for you. It's good for you psychologically because you're looking at the trees, and it's good for you physiologically because you're breathing in compounds, chemicals produced by the trees, which are interacting with your body. It's been found that a lunchtime walk of 1.8 kilometers, whatever that is in miles these days, in woodland will actually help you sleep better. If you take the same amount of walking in amongst buildings, it doesn't work. You have to be walking in green areas. And it's also been shown that a 3-day forest visit, where you spend all day in the forest and you sleep in the forest, improves your immune system for up to a month thereafter, because of the psychological and the physiological benefits of being in amongst trees. So really, when you look at it, trees have all sorts of benefits to us in all sorts of ways. They may not solve climate change by what we can plant now, but they play an incredibly important part in climate change scenarios. They're also very important for the compounds and the various chemicals and the foods and the drinks they actually give to us. And they're incredibly important for our well-being. So hopefully in the future, people will actually appreciate trees a little bit more. So thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. That was absolutely brilliant, and
Thank you.
a good view of so many different aspects of trees. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh,
I
good.
can. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Has anybody any questions they want to ask? There are some in the chat, and we can pull some of those out. I do have one thought. Looking at trees, looking at greenery is good for health, and I would agree that I would rather sit doing nothing at the table looking at the garden than sit in the front room reading a book on a cold day. Do you think that this general benefit to health and well-being reflects something deeply embedded in us from our evolution? So we sort of look back on the days when we were perhaps much happier and more natural than we are now.
That's a very good point. If you think about the evolutionary history of humans, we've spent something like 99.9% of our evolutionary history in woodlands and forests.
Yes.
Amongst trees. So yes, I think you're right. It's hardwired into us. It's ingrained into us, even though we may not realise it. The trees are what we actually need to look at.
Yeah, and I would press the advantages of indoor plants as well. Trees ones are easy to look after, but you know, you can have a bit of greenery in your living room and look at it at night when you can't see the garden.
Yep, very good point.
Yeah. Has anybody else got any questions they'd like to ask? Let me have a look at the chat.
I've got some questions listed here, George, in case you want me to ask them.
Yep, far away, Andrew.
JK wanted to know, is mace as pungent or dangerous as nutmeg? Is it the same thing or not?
Ah, right. It does contain some of the myristacine, but it has a smaller amount, which is why it's a much milder taste of nutmeg. So in theory, mace should be less toxic than nutmeg.
Right. JK has another question. What sort of trees does the Miyawaki method use? Seedlings or cuttings?
Anything, doesn't matter. You can use cuttings, you can use very young trees, you know, virtually still seedlings, you can use saplings, you can use bare root stock, anything you like. As long as that it's all roughly the same sort of material. Because if you start planting seedlings with cuttings, the cuttings are like to grow before the seedlings. But in the big picture, it doesn't really matter too much. In some places, they've actually had people bring along whatever trees they've got hanging around in their garden, in pots, etc., and they've used those. In some ways, that's probably more important because then it really does become the local people's forest. They're their trees. I've planted my trees in there. It's wonderful.
Alejandra wants to know what difficulties are trees having to adapt to with climate change? Could you help us with how to see a tree beyond the name of the species, how to observe a tree and see the challenges it has faced?
Yeah, the big problem with trees is that they are the longest living organisms we have on Earth. The oldest trees in the world are a shade over 5,000 years old, which is older than the pyramids. And even in this country, we have trees like oaks and yews, which will live for well over 1,000 years. So the problem is, if we start planting trees now, will they be able to cope with the climate in 1,000 years' time? And the answer is almost certainly not. So what we should be doing is planting trees from further south. Now this goes against the grain, doesn't it? Because we like to plant local provenances so that we're looking after, we're keeping the genotype of, say, an oak woodland the same. But really, we should be bringing oak trees from maybe northern France, maybe even the middle of France, into Britain and planting them now, so that in 200-300 years' time, when they are getting to be mature trees, they can still cope with the climate. So we really have to be moving trees further north.
Maureen Parry, the botany section representative on council, asks, are trees so much better at sequestering carbon than grassland or scrub?
Yes, because of the sheer amount of biomass you get in a forest. I mean, grasslands are very important. Bogs are tremendously important. They can actually hold more carbon than a forest. But the benefit of a forest is not just the carbon you have above ground, it's that huge amount of carbon you can store underneath, which is even more than you can store in a grassland. mean, grasslands are very important. And certainly if you've got a grassland that's important for wildlife, we shouldn't be planting trees on it, because there is still a fair bit of carbon being caught by the grassland, and it has other benefits to wildlife. But overall, if you're interested in just carbon, forests do win hands down in terms of how much carbon they store.
Catriona asks, any thoughts on carbon offsetting to absolve the conscience of flyers? I
Yes.
suppose digital flyers, I suppose.
Yeah, if you want to fly around the world and you want to get somebody to plant a tree, there is one problem with this though. If you look at a woodland or a forest, it will keep on soaking up carbon until it's mature. Once it's mature, you can't fit any more biomass into the woodland and you can't fit any more carbon into the soil. So a mature forest will soak up carbon every year, but it will release the same amount of carbon back into the atmosphere. So look at the Amazon jungle, for example. We think about the Amazon basin as being the lungs of the world, but actually it's carbon neutral. It soaks up huge amounts of carbon every year, but being a mature forest, it releases almost the same amount of carbon straight back into the atmosphere. So if you plant a woodland to sequester carbon, and say you use poplars, fast-growing poplars, you'll say, well, I need to plant 5 of those trees so I can fly to New York, or whatever the figures are. When those trees are mature, you have to start planting another area of woodland. You can't fell that woodland and get rid of it because you lose the carbon in it, and you can't expect that woodland to keep on soaking up carbon. So it's a bit of a two-edged sword, that you have to make sure that when you plant the trees, they are kept forever, because you can't let the carbon escape, and you have to keep on planting new areas of woodland to soak up new amounts of carbon. So it's not quite as simple as it first looks, is it?
JK wants to know, what is the comparable amount of stored carbon in peat worldwide? Is it more or less than trees?
It'll be, that's a very good question. I should be able to tell you those figures. I looked at those not so long ago and I can't remember. I think you'll find that the amount stored in peat worldwide is actually more than is stored in all the forests. But I mean, peat growth is really quite slow, certainly under present climate conditions. But they're a bit like forests. It's not how much carbon they're taking up, it's how much they have stored over the millions of years. So yeah, peat bogs are really quite important for carbon sequestration. Just can't remember the exact figures, but they are important.
We have one more question, if there are any, Andrew, and then we're past the end of our time. We better call it a day.
Right.
There is just one more question left. So it's J. Kennedy Cruikshank. What proportion of carbon is stored in deciduous tree leaves falling annually?
Sorry, what proportion of carbon?
What proportion of carbon is stored in deciduous tree leaves falling annually?
Right.
All the leaves that drop from trees, from deciduous trees.
Right, you're looking at about something, or less than 10% of the carbon stored in the leaves. And of course, once the leaves hit the ground, they then decompose, don't they? So that carbon goes back into the atmosphere. But it is quite a small percentage, less than 10%. More in some trees like beeches, where the leaves are thicker, less in trees which have more delicate leaves, like birches.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andrew. Peter, that was absolutely brilliant. Covered a wide range of topics, as I said. I'm delighted that you're able to present it to us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, we'll end the meeting now then.